we're celebrating the centennial, the American centennial of Dr. Fu Manchu, the immortal character created by Sax Rohmer, who was part of a larger tradition that we know collectively as the Yellow Peril. So to start things off, we're going to throw this to Nathan Madison, whose book, as Mike just mentioned, covers this entire phenomenon in some detail in American popular culture. So Nathan, I'm going to ask you to set the stage for our listeners and explain what was going on, where the term Yellow Peril originated, and we'll talk about some of the fictional characters from there. So set it up with some historical background.
Thank you. The term Yellow Peril comes from a speech given by Kaiser Wilhelm around the turn of the century, referring to pretty much everybody in China. As far as a literary device, it goes back a number of years, long before Sax Rohmer wrote Fu Manchu. I'd say there's sort of two things that really kind of set the stage for this sort of story that comes into effect was the instability in China that had existed since the 1840s, the Opium Wars, carving out larger and larger sections. As a result of that, China was entering more into popular press of America and Europe, so you kept getting these stories of China, unstable China, a weakened emperor. And secondly, the idea of the Tongs, the secret societies, which were a part of Chinese history. Going back thousands of years, they were nationalistic groups. It's important to note at the time, China was not ruled by a Chinese emperor, but rather a Manchurian emperor. So there were these nationalistic secret societies that were always behind rebellions and usurpations and revolutions. So around the turn of the century, all that came into play, as well as the Boxer Rebellion from 1898 to 1901. The Boxers were one of these secret societies, nationalistic in nature, and in these foreign nations that a lot of Western countries had in China, they were going around killing essentially white Christians. So that's going to come into play in the popular press. Probably embellished to some degree, but when Sax Rohmer started writing Fu Manchu, we have this kind of stereotype of wild savages in China, incapable of modern Western government, and we're out to get the white world, essentially.
So with that in mind, let's turn to Bill Maynard, who in addition to being the new chronicler of Fu Manchu's adventures is quite a scholar, quite an expert on the character. So Bill, why don't you fill us in, take it up from there, how Sax Rohmer came to create Fu Manchu and what it meant in the larger sense in terms of representing this phenomenon.
Sure. I mean, as Nathan said very well in regard to the Pulps as well as the Sax Rohmer wasn't his first family was to go through this, but he was the one who turned it into an archetype. By immortalizing that, I think honestly the biggest step was overcoming the Professor Moriarty's model. I could speculate as others have. The Calvary branch of Sherlock is that guy who pleased Dr. Nicolai was also a family. So in taking this racist sort of fear of holding other and remove that idea, is the fact that the colonialist mind and influence did not feel an instant sense of superiority, which is what they generally brought to every other foreign nation that they encountered. There's this fear that they're different, that they need something different, that they acknowledge that it's different, the sheer numbers could overwhelm them, and there was a fear of a near foreign alien threat. And by Rohmer taking that xenophobic reaction and applying that to the supervillain role that had already been popularized by Conan Doyle, he hit on the winning formula. In order for that character to really take root as a series, what was necessary was a degree of reader sympathy. Something to never feel full Moriarty said. And in order to do that, it was to play upon, since he would have some knowledge of the denizens of Limehouse, of the Chinese district in England's called, he played upon the very real sense of honor he encountered. And by making Fu Manchu a man of his word, he would use this villain or unintentional, but a more sophisticated view of the villain as someone who's just ideologically opposed to the people he's facing. Not necessarily a bad man, just coming at it from a different perspective. And that's really, I think, if we look back on it today from hindsight, those of us who look past the political correctness, the humanistics, or the remarks that we find especially in your results, you see the fact that you've got a character that despite being maligned is politically incorrect, really represents the intelligence and the honor of these people, and doesn't seem to denigrate in a better ways. It's easier to find criticism of the enemies from a 21st century perspective.
So, Gene, as an authority on the early Pulps and on Sax Rohmer, maybe you can fill us in on some of the literary stuff, some of the early Rohmer works, and some of the other characters that he had.
Sure. Of course, Fu Manchu's the best known. That's how I got into this when I was about 12 or 13 years old. But Rohmer has a very rich body of work outside the Fu Manchu novels and the short stories. And you know, he's got characters like Paul Harley, who was in several books, a couple of books and several short stories, and Inspector Red Carey and the Samuru novels, and all of this. So there's a lot of Rohmer out there that, well, in fact, a few years ago when I put together the first of the Black Dog books, collections of the non-Fu Manchu stuff, I was shocked at how much has never been published here. And in the first two collections, we were able to put 4 stories in each one that had never been published in America before. So, shocking lapse. And more recently, I've just been reading this book by my Aunt Agatha. The Big Four is the name of it, and basically it's a Sax Rohmer novel. It's told the same way that the original Fu Manchu novel was. It was a series of stories complete in themselves, but they tie together. It's about a big international conspiracy headed by 4 people, one of whom is Chinese. That I had not heard of it until recently, but certainly even she is stealing from Sax Rohmer.
I would add that of course, we're here to celebrate pulp magazines. The early Fu Manchu adventures in America did not actually appear in a pulp magazine. They appeared in Collier's, which was one of the prominent slicks and one of the best paying of the slick markets. I mean, next to probably the Saturday Evening Post, I think Collier's at that time was the publication that most fictioneers aspired to crack. However, Rohmer, a lot of Rohmer's work his other works were published in pulps, especially short stories. He sold a number of things to Harry Mall's Short Stories, which was owned by the Doubleday Company, which of course eventually became Rohmer's American publisher. His early books here were published by McBride, right? And he eventually took Fu Manchu and some of his other books to Doubleday. I think it was in the late 20s or mid-20s. And so he appeared in short stories and some other pulps. But Fu himself, the insidious doctor, appeared in Collier's. But he, of course, was not the only villain of this type. And Will, maybe you can fill us in on some of the other pulp characters, villains who appeared in what magazines they appeared in.
Well, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Well, the interesting thing about Fu Manchu and his imitators is that he didn't have very many imitators when he was first introduced in Pakistan before World War I. And Sax Rohmer put him on hiatus for a number of years and revived him in, 32 with Daughter of Fu Manchu?
Daughter, yeah.
Daughter was the fourth and return of Fu Manchu after a significant hiatus of that period. And what's interesting about that is it triggered a wave of pulp imitations of Fu Manchu on the one hand, but it also triggered a wave of anti-Fu Manchu along the way. And what I mean by that is you have Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto, who are sort of inversions of Fu Manchu, attempts to go against Ricochet and xenophobia and all that. But in the Pulps, you have publishers like Street and Smith who would try to avoid Asian villains of the Fu Manchu type because times had changed and there was a bit less racism less tolerance, and also I think Chinese community is more vocal in complaining in the 1930s than they were in the teens. They were more very much entrenched into the second, third, fourth generation. But popular publications had no such scruples. In 1934, I think it was, they had Robert J. Hogan here, successfully launched GA and not so successfully launched Secret Six. They had to do a few and ran, I think, 7 issues. It was pitched on the juvenile level that Hogan's audience tended to be. They folded it after 7 issues, and I understand they folded it because of copyright issues. And the reason was there had been a previous film, I think, in newspaper strips. So if the story I heard is true, the copyright issues so keep playing. It was because of the many thing. And there were, not many Pulps are along, Chinese films of different types that didn't always rise to the level of two. That's a distinction that's important to kind of push you get a villain with that ethnicity and Chinese, for some reason, Japanese, or, international regions where we didn't find Irish guys. Really? Well, for some reason, Henry Steger thought the instrumentation idea was so good. So he hired Robert J. Kehoe, this is Donald Kehoe, another aviation writer, on a much more mature level. We had Ken White as an detective, and was he a director at that time? No. Yeah, okay. Well, Ken White was a high level editor. I think Steve Fisher's wife, he was science editor. But Kehoe launched Dr. Yen Sin, which was a much more competitive. And probably should have lasted longer, because they read much better than the new plans. But according to Steger, they discovered that Yen Sin had a sexual connotation. So they had to pull that one. A little known fact, and I discovered this recently, if this in fact is an actual discovery. I work for Radio Audio and watched the first audio book, and I didn't do more, which was overseas. So I've been looking at GAs fairly intensively for good stories, and I discovered a few months after this series plan was folded, Hogan introduced Chu Lung, a Chinese mastermind in the Jewish tradition in 1936 story. GA. What's interesting about the story is the character has some of the same attributes and being the same names. Not Chu Lung, the same, what do you call it, nom de guerre, as Wu Fang. And I wouldn't be surprised if Hogan either recycled the Wu Fang plot or a partially or completely finished manuscript of the review launched Chu Lung, the first Chu Lung story, because the first Chu Lung story, which is Skies of Yellow Death, has some lot less aviation stuff than your typical GA. So Hogan continued his character as the GA film, over 4 years. The Chu Lung kept coming back and back. Well, that was the end of the Fu Manchu imitator, the popular students men always avoid the Fu Manchu type, although they had a lot of villains of certain types, and they would do a Chinese mastermind for the most part to do the right job. So that way they could get out the hook of any complaints. But in 1939 and 40, Walter Gibson launched the very famous, he justified so Golden Master, Shadow novels featuring Chu on time and Senator Davis time. Really wonderful novels, completely unlike any Shadow novels before. And those were reprinting their controlling some second books in the coming months, which were the basis of the Shadow movie from 20 years ago. That was probably the last big human communications that mattered in the public, because not long after G1Con, where we were in World War II, the Chinese were our allies, and the Office of War Commission sent out bulletins to all publishers and writers saying, here's a good idea for stories to help morale. He said, we want to see stories of Chinese characters, negative and villains, because they're our allies. So we have Dr. Zen Lane, the Zen salesman, another writer, Asian Dark Savage operating in Chinatown. That ran a few stories. And those pretty much everything like that. And so maybe we get into the Cold War era and drop characters who might be Asian, kind of borderline, things that suggest they're going to be implicit. So I would say the Fu Manchu imitation cycle was the heaviest in the Depression.
That's pretty good. To that, I would add one other character who I find very interesting was Street Smith character created for Detective Story magazine by A.E. Apple, Mr. Chang, who was one of these odd characters in that, technically speaking, he was a villain. You know, the funny thing about Detective Story magazine, I don't know how many of you folks read it or collect it, there are damn few detectives in Detective Story magazine. The protagonists of the series, the recurring characters, tend to be kind of vigilante heroes, of whom Johnston McCulley created scores for that magazine, or wealthy millionaires who dabble in crime fighting as an antidote to boredom. But Mr. Chang was, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, so I won't say definitively, but I believe he was the only Asian character to carry his own series who was not what we would call a good guy, although he was a protagonist in that the stories were built around him, and he was clearly the most important character. It's a truism of old movie serial writers that they said the key to a good serial was not the hero, but the villain. And if you could make the villain compelling, it almost didn't matter what the hero was, because the hero was always reacting to what the villain was doing. So in that respect, the Mr. Chang series is very interesting, and it was certainly interesting enough that a lot of the stories were collected and published in hardcovers by Chelsea House, which was Street Smith's hardcover subsidiary. So I don't know if any of those stories are currently in print, but there's certain. We have Garen Roberts who says, "Is that a yes?"
George is bringing them out. They're typeset, as I understood, proofread, and the complete Mr. Chang.
Okay, so George Vanderberg of Battered Silicone Dispatch Box is planning a Mr. Chang collection. That's of interest to those of us who are interested in this kind of literature. So as Will said, once World War II came along, we found ourselves allies with the Chinese. The Japanese became villains in their own right. And then, of course, there was a shift after the war as the Chinese communists took over, and then for a while Koreans were not our favorites. We get up to the 60s, and we have a whole nother trend going, and Wynn's going to talk about kind of another descendant of Fu Manchu in a literary sense who carried on the tradition.
So as many of you may be aware, the Fu Manchu series really carried on under a different name, starting in the early 1970s when Marvel Comics got the license to do Shang-Chi and Hand of Kung Fu, which is really about Fu Manchu's son, Shang-Chi. The series carried on for actually over a decade. The interesting thing about this, if you are a reader of Silver Age Marvel Comics, is that if you're aware of all the superhero comics, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and all that, they really invited the other characters from the oeuvre into all the different titles. So there was lots of going back and forth, lots of crossovers. And really, they handled the Shang-Chi series in a very different way. If you look at the complete run, they bring in very few other Marvel Comics characters, and they really kind of try to maintain the purity of a continuation of the Fu Manchu series, although, of course, it is centered on his son, who turns out to be of a decidedly heroic bent. And instead of looking to the comic book parallels and trying to bring those in, they look to the literary antecedents and try to connect Fu Manchu to some of the other genres that had influenced it. So as Bill had mentioned, Sax Rohmer had been influenced by Doyle, and they actually carried that to the next level and sort of unabashedly talked about some of the connections that some of the characters have to some of the Doyle characters. Moving forward past the 1960s into the early 1970s, we also have sort of a new face on supervillains with the advent of the Fleming effect and James Bond villains. And so villains sort of were even grander than they had been in the earlier, more flamboyant. And you get a sense of that with the way Fu Manchu is depicted in this series, and so the schemes, they're very Fleming-esque, so you can definitely see James Bond influence in the series. They actually bring in a character, a supporting character, who is also related to the James Bond series. The interesting thing about that is that they did have the rights to do crossovers with the superhero characters and with Shang-Chi, but they did them in the other titles. So if you kind of eliminate those, from Shang-Chi appearing in an issue of Spider-Man, they didn't bring Spider-Man into Shang-Chi. So you can read that whole series almost as a series of sort of epic Sax Rohmer novels, obviously not by Rohmer, but heavily influenced by them. And you get this cycle of Shang-Chi sort of growing and at the end kind of almost coming to terms with his father before his father is eliminated, supposedly for his father. But I believe that it ends with the world here.
As is only fitting. Nathan, let's go back to you. Maybe you can fill us in, based on all the research you've done on the historical aspects, maybe you can fill us in on early trends, the kinds of plot devices that were used in so-called Yellow Peril kind of cartoons, how they related to real-life events, character types, the way the characters were defined, what parallels, if any, they had to actual events or actual people. Were any of the great Oriental villains modeled on certain very specific people? For example, Charlie Chan is said to have been based on an actual Honolulu policeman. Is there a comparable Oriental villain that you find in some of the early literature?
Yeah, there are a couple of characters that are based on people throughout Chinese history, mostly brigands and bandits who, by the fact that they were part of these secret societies, they became pretty well known in China, and any American that was over there in China automatically heard stories about them, and they were brought over here. The best example that comes to mind is stories of Robert James Peril, which I wrote an introduction for his collected works recently. He had a villain named Koshinga, which was he was based on a pirate from the 16th century who was one of these nationalistic secret society guys who were fighting against the Manchurians as soon as they were, right when they were starting to consolidate the power over China. There are other Parasol stories and other stories use secret societies that appeared throughout history. Maybe sometimes they're actual names, sometimes variations on it. There's this kind of goes back to the Pulps, but there was a dime novel series, Jeff Clayton series, around 1905, 1910. These issues that I found, and they deal with one of those deals with a character that's obviously based on an actual historical person from mid-19th century China. He led a rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion, which was pretty much this guy had failed all the civil service exams, which would have gotten him into the hierarchy of the empire. He had a kind of a nervous breakdown after that, had a vision where he believed that he was the younger brother of Jesus. And these visions led him to create a religious movement, which led to a rebellion, which led to a giant revolt that almost overthrew the Manchurian emperor and was put down eventually by the intervention of Western powers. But the Jeff Clayton story and a couple other stories from the 20th century based their stories on this Taiping Rebellion, later stories were based on the Fox Rebellion. So, as far as not really actual individuals, but more so events that have occurred in the past, were kind of the basis for some of the stories, both in China and events that happened in some of the China spread out there across America, or the Limehouse district. Some of the stories are based on, like the most of these events and actual.
Bill, let's go back to you. Rohmer was very well traveled. Maybe you can fill us in on how his own travels and his own life experiences informed the Fu Manchu story.
So much of the room is on this is good quality. Started in 2000, largely where he showed the center of some of the one that was regular trips and trips. He takes to relay on this video 2 minutes ago, I think it's very well with this side. He takes this series progressive and players and moves them into the picture mold. There's a long tradition of that, and we from the stuff and styles like our instructor, always been from the hospital, back into the Peril nutrition, and to make that work for us. So what was being said earlier about the secret society, I think it's important to me that, again, like in terms of youth secret, that Nicola idea takes it back to this occult movement that was gaining greater power in the West in the Victorian era. You've got these books, they're talking about these two characters, the two female occult characters. And we'll see what's happening with Oxford analogs.
Oh, we need Madam Christie and
Yeah, right, thank you. And it's very easy if you don't know your history properly to look at a Google and think this is Alistair Crowley from actually. That's an impossibility of that's probably what it was. And this whole idea of secret societies, almost like the conspiracy theory of the Illuminati that continues to this day, that's something that has really caught my imagination. And that's sort of over and above it. That's why you've got teenage people literally coming from with ongoing firing of crackers or many who's creating a Chinese name and Chinese persona in Flash 40. So all of this sort of and at the same time, the problem with mentioned, the liberal Germans will be around during the same period, starting with the World War I. And then certainly the Second World War, 50 years ago, German characters, there's probably throughout comics, throughout film and television, it's very easy to see the sort of notion that Nazis quickly become secret societies that always appear to be run by Germans, whether Wolfgang or Karl Stromberg or Chaos and Bismarck. It just becomes this idea that whoever we identify as our nuclear enemy, whether the Chinese, the Japanese, the Germans, that's all of our fears personified. And to add to that, the occult is the other thing. It terrifies people when you think of their secret knowledge that will allow them to take over. And so really this whole genre is sort of driven by the parallel fear that there are people that are different from us, have different values, and have knowledge that far exceeds anything we can combat. And that's really what the root of it.
Am I right in saying that Rohmer himself believed very strongly in these things? He wasn't faking this. I think he had a real belief in the occult and the power of the Eastern ways, the mysterious ways.
He definitely had a belief in it. The thing that's always funny with Rohmer is, particularly at this, Rohmer loved to, let's say, bolster his reputation by covering falsehoods. So he would exaggerate his involvement in the occult. I think King would certainly agree with that with the research he's doing for this next Black Dog books that's from the library. He would use connections at the family physician who genuinely was involved in secret societies, take a bit of knowledge and use it to sort of advance his reputation. But in various interviews, he talks about the fact that he could have to give a marketing system so that he would lock himself up, close himself off, and be in an agitated mood to write. And that agitated mood is part of that kind of paranoia that we see. So to a degree, he got to work himself up to this level of, being so upset. I mean, when we write this as if I'm on the verge of a breakdown. One of the favorite things to note from this Christian is how many books begin with a bizarre, what was that? Sort of open in mind. And it generally is a noise or a knocking on the door, something disturbs someone, and from that moment on, there's never a peaceful moment to be spared.
Gene, why don't you pick it up from there? Tell us a little bit more about the new Rohmer collection that you're working on and what you've discovered, any additional themes, any embellishments on what's already been said?
Well, the thing that Bill's talking about in our collection is Rohmer wrote a book on the occult called The Romance of Sorcery. It's been reprinted several times. But he also wrote several articles, including the introduction to the doctor's book that Bill was talking about, which is about alchemy. The doctor was really a believer in alchemy. Rohmer wrote the introduction, and this is the only time that Rohmer ever wrote the introduction to somebody else's work. So what we're doing is gathered all these things, including one about Rasputin, an article about Rasputin that's never been printed any persons, 1917 or something like that. And this will be the complete occult writers of Saxon, complete romance of sorcery. One of the other things about the other non-Fu Manchu stuff is that this versatility. Now, he wrote about the occult. He wrote stories that may have seen the occult and it didn't, and turned out not to be, or left you to question, was it really occult? And then some were just outright really occult, like The Brood of the Witch Queen, a novel that I'm not real high on.
So I love when I first read it, that, that experience is sensitive.
Well, good thing anyway. He did a lot of mysteries, and I think one of the things I discovered, I had read this years ago, but in doing these collections, I read it again. One of the best things I think he ever did in our short is a story called The White Hat. And if you will read it and change the names of Paul Harley and Knox to Holmes and Watson, it is the Sherlock Holmes story. You can see Conan Doyle writing this. It's probably his best tribute to Conan Doyle as a literary recommended art.
When I'm asking this as much for myself as for the benefit of the audience, because I don't know the answer to this myself, but I'm wondering to what extent, if any, does Fu Manchu or any of these other characters play a role in the world movie universe?
So that's an interesting question. In the very first World Movie book, Tarzan Alive, Farmer had touched on the Fu Manchu series, and it basically said, taking a step back, Farmer plays the game, Sherlockian game, that it's all real, and that the writings of Watson were actual recordings of events that happened, and that they were basically transcribed and edited for publication. And Farmer expands this and plays this game at a higher level in Tarzan Alive than what I'm doing Tarzan. And in discussing the wider World Movie family, he basically decides in the first book, Tarzan Alive, that Fu Manchu was fictional, which I think we can probably all agree in this context. But does say that if Fu Manchu had not been fictional, that Nayland Smith would have been the nephew of Sherlock Holmes. He then, the following year, having discovered and done more research in his follow-up biography, Doc Savage, Life, decides that he had actually been incorrect, and that Fu Manchu actually was a real person, actually was based on a different person who was real, who was named Hanoi Shan. Rick Lay has since demonstrated in a very academic way that Hanoi Shan was a sham, and that Hanoi Shan was not a real person, and that Bill had been in error in saying that Sax Rohmer based Fu Manchu on the real person, Hanoi Shan. So that was very confusing, and I apologize for that. But Fu Manchu, in Phil's perspective, as well as Nayland Smith, is a real person if you are approaching it from the World Movie framework. I'd like to extend that just a little bit and kind of talk about some of the other appearances of Fu Manchu that are absolutely not canonical, but that were intended to be slight with references to Fu Manchu. Fu Manchu appeared in several crossover tales, which were written by August Derleth, about his Sherlock Holmes that he actually shoulder bumps. And there are actually 3 of those tales, which occurred in the 1920s. And then Basil Copper who picked up the series after they left, actually wrote another one too. So we have some unnamed appearances by the Devil Doctor there. Going back to actually authorized appearances, as Bill and probably many others well know, there was Kay Van Ash, who was Bill's predecessor as the authorized writer of the Fu Manchu novels. And Kay Van Ash wrote a novel in the 1980s called 10 Years Beyond Baker Street, which was a full-on authorized Fu Manchu Sherlock Holmes crossover. Of course, Kay Van Ash followed it up with Fires of Fu Manchu. And then we have several other crossover appearances. Probably one of the most notable of which, and maybe one of the places that you would least expect to find the Fu Manchu crossover, in a 1967 Man from Uncle tie-in novel called The Rainbow Affair, written by David McDaniel, in which Napoleon Solo and his partner and spy, Ilya Kuryakin, encounter many different characters, unnamed again, of course, but written in a way that you can understand who they are, including Fu Manchu. And if you're familiar with the Man from Uncle series, you know that there is a crush, and that crush in this particular novel was actually trying to recruit Fu Manchu to join their ranks. Kind of very much tying into Rick White's point from the other evening. Whereas if you were to move Fu Manchu into the 1960s, he actually had quite a bit of competition in the world domination game with that.
Before we throw it open to questions, I'd like to add a couple of small things from my own wheelhouse talking about the movies. It's very interesting that what we would generally call Yellow Peril fiction was very popular in the early melodramatic cinema, the early silent era, and especially in the movie serial, which of course thrived on the most lurid, sensationalistic sorts of characters and plot devices. And a key figure, possibly the key figure in the depiction of Eastern Asian characters on the screen was Warner Oland, who, to the best of my knowledge, played his first Asian villain, Baron Hiroki, in a 1917 serial called Patria, produced by William Randolph Hearst. It was a serial released by Cathay Pictures. What's interesting about this is that it was made at Hearst's request from an idea that he had, because Hearst, with his own paranoid delusions, believed that the Japanese were conspiring with Mexico to invade the United States from the southern border. And Patria is the story of Patria Channing, who is a daughter of the American Revolution type, who inherits a fabulous fortune and is charged with fighting just such an invasion. Warner Oland again played Hiroki. This angered not only the Japanese but the Mexicans as well, and while President Woodrow Wilson was not terribly upset with Mexican opposition because of Pancho Villa's sort of depredations, he was sensitive to the Japanese concerns. So while the movie was in distribution, he asked Hearst to have it removed from circulation and altered. They said, "Can you change Baron Hiroki? Can you remake this film so that we have a different villain who's not Japanese?" And Hearst said, "Absolutely not." So he got continual pressure. The State Department got involved, and eventually, because they were far less concerned with what the Mexicans had to say about this, the Baron Hiroki character became Manuel Morales, and all the film's inner titles, this was a silent movie, remember, were changed to reflect this. So you've got a guy named Manuel Morales who's wearing kimonos. Warner Oland, shortly after that, played a villain called Wu Fang in a 1919 Pearl White serial called The Lightning Raider. And Lightning was Pearl White, and she was kind of a female Raffles. And Wu Fang was the guy who, that was her kind of her perennial arch nemesis, a competing figure in the underworld. After that, Oland played several other Oriental characters, and then in 1929, he played Dr. Fu Manchu in two Paramount movies released that year, The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu and The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu. It's my belief, now I don't know exactly how this squares up with the Rohmer biography, but it's my belief that the success of these films, both of which were enormous box office hits. Remember, talkies were very new. Oland already had an established reputation for playing characters like this. It's my belief that the enormous success of these films was a catalyst in the writing of Daughter of Fu Manchu, which is, as Will mentioned before, kicked the series back into high gear after a long hiatus. And furthermore, when Hollywood showed an interest in the following novel, The Mask of Fu Manchu, which I don't think was in colors, that was in Liberty, wasn't it? Was that more than or Mask?
Yeah. It's probably Cosmopolitan.
Oh, right, Mask, right. Yeah, so anyway, I believe that at this point in Rohmer's career, because in between the time, I mean, he'd written a lot of stuff during the 20s having nothing to do with Fu Manchu, but I believe these early talkie successes really prolonged the life of the series and really jump-started it. So, and we have Warner Roland to thank for that. Of course, after a final cameo as Fu Manchu in a 1931 film called Daughter of the Dragon, which is ostensibly an adaptation of Daughter of Fu Manchu, but a completely original script. It was shortly after completing that film that he was signed by Fox Pictures to make Charlie Chan Carries On, the first of a couple dozen appearances he made as that famous character created by Earl Vickers. So we can see that the popular literature and comic strips, there was a Fu Manchu comic strip drawn by Leo Amelia. Fu Manchu was on radio in several different incarnations, right? So it all feeds into each other, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between characters and mediums. So anyway, I want to add something else?
Just one thing that I think we can point out in one of the other theories is kind of create new characters that we never without. Where new characters he kills off Sherlock Holmes, he kills off Philo Vance, and one other character. I think he kills and there's a certain thing he does. I think it was but still, there's this weird idea of parents having fun with the process, just having their game take out all these really great detectives. They get away with it.
So let's have some questions while we still can. I'd ask you that if possible you stand up and give us your question loudly and distinctly so everybody can hear. Aaron, let's start with you in the back.
Couple of quick things. First of all, Nathan, I think your book is one of the best that's been done in years. That's an amazing book. I got it in Boston this spring, and I read it entirely before I went to bed that night. It is one of the best studies I've ever seen in popular culture, and I hope you get some award nominations for it. I think Will was talking about Norman Marsh's Dan Dunn with the Wu Fing reference in comic strips. I'd point out a couple of other quick things. M.P. Shield actually had novels called Yellow Peril and things like that in the 1890s. Michael Crichton in the 1980s does a book called Rising Sun. And one other thing I wrote down here. Let's see here. Well, I wanted to tell you that for my money, Mr. Chang was the most insidious of the Yellow Perils. I remember one particular episode after he tortured and killed his victim, he then decided to torture and kill the victim's horse. So he was bad. Mr. Chang was bad.
Boy, is he strict.
I'd like to throw out some factoids that may or may not polish my reputation as a Pulp expert. A.E. Apple, who owns actually E.A. Apple, I believe, came to a very sad end. You guys know about that? Okay. This was in the newspapers in the late 20s, early 30s. He had written a story, might have been a story of Eckert story magazine, which he made as a villain, or one of the villains that he wanted to be on lawyer about a certain name. Turns out there was something not to lawyer about a name, whether he knew it or not was clear. And Smith was sued, and he was sued. And a judgment was rendered, and Mr. Apple lost his status as Steve Smith very abruptly and committed suicide. Another obscure factoid possibly of use. Mid was talking to Pastor Tom Cruise, and she was including too. The black and white Doc Savage magazine from the mid-70s was on the verge of having the Doc Savage and Stealing the Cheese story authorized. When the magazine was folded, and/or there was a problem with the rights. But I don't think the writer of the series Doug mentioned told me that they were getting ready to do documents in the children, and yeah, I guess there were several things. There was the Norman Mark and there was the Pearl Pauline. So when the popular had the serious thing, they were probably getting fire from numerous.
One thing you mentioned, of course, about how two detectives were in fact. What was the first cover of Detective Comics? So, you know, one is the comic. Also, the like 2 years before he did top that, for 2 years, about 1 year, Paul Worthy, who was created two days
Yeah, he was just kind of
Did everybody hear that? Did you hear that back there? You did. Okay, we got other, thank you, Tony. We got other questions? Yes, sir.
Now, my favorite Fu Manchu crossover was very thinly disguised Fu Manchu appeared in Remo Williams, The Destroyer. Does anybody remember who wrote that?
We got a destroyer expert up here.
You know, I've written a lot of novels. I forgot that I did. And you know, and Bruce Lee was his sidekick, or his unnamed sidekick. Yeah, I did do a Fu Manchu meets Remo, but you know, heavily disguised because of legal issues, but you know, disguised in a satirical way, so it was acceptable. Whereas some, you know, it might not have been acceptable if I'd actually had Fu Manchu in the book and not had fun with him, twisted him around. But yeah, I did do that. I kind of forgot that.
Yes, I was thinking about Iron Man's arch nemesis, the Mandarin, and then how that was, I don't know, sort of destroyed a little bit with this last Iron Man 3 movie.
The question was about the Iron Man villain, the Mandarin. So who wants to handle it? Is that something you can do with?
I can do that.
Yeah, someone else can do that because I haven't seen
Well, I
it.
was buying this comic in the 60s, and I once interviewed Don Heck, who was the artist who conceptualized the Mandarin. And he told me that the character came about when Stan Lee, the writer-editor, said, hey, I want to do a villain, Iron Man fights a Fu Manchu type. So it was literally a version of Fu Manchu tricked up with Magic Rangers and just so it was.
I'm getting the hook here. We got time for 2 more questions. John?
Yeah, it's along those same lines. The one Marvel Comics supervillain that comes to mind is the Yellow Claw. And I first became aware of him around the mid-'70s. I was about 10 years old. He appeared in a Captain America story arc, and I was pretty young at the time. I had no context, and then just in this past year, I've been reading Bill's books, and I've realized, hell, Yellow Claw was basically just a variation of Fu Manchu, and I wonder if you guys want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, and I think the Yellow Claw first appeared, I think, in the 50s, originally in Marvel Comics. The only thing I'd really add to that is that since Marvel no longer has the rights to the Fu Manchu series, you know, for going on 30 years now, but Shang-Chi is their own creation, and still on that, I believe that they have retconned Yellow Claw as Shang-Chi's father.
This is going to have to be our last question, so. Yes, can you? You, sir.
There's been talk for the last 25, 30 years of a Fu Manchu movie. Do any of you actually think this is a possibility?
It is a possibility. I'll take this one. Harry Allen Towers, who some of you know the name Harry Allen Towers, he acquired the rights, he's now deceased, back in the 60s. And his widow, former actress Maria Towers, who you know very well there, she still controls those rights. There is a production company, this thing's company, Pacific Horizon, who is some new movie on Nelson Mandela coming out. They have held an option for a number of years now. The only thing I can say is it's at the script stage, The decision has been for a number of years that it would be an Asian actor in the role, that it would be not a politically correct spin on it, one that looked at it more as simply opposed, but not a bad villainous character. But the consensus has been it's a tough nut to crack, especially with that name. And I don't think that they've got a story yet that they like, or a script that they've seen that they like. And there's interest from other, at least one other, let's say, Hollywood producer who's good at that sort of thing, who'd love to be a piece of it. So we'll see what happens.
I'll point out also that it's interesting in terms of politically incorrect. We mentioned that phrase. In the 1929 film that rebooted the franchise, The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu, it had an origin story, so to speak. And in that, Fu Manchu is a kindly doctor who is driven to his hatred of the white man, specifically the English, because during the Boxer Rebellion, his family is killed by British soldiers. So that kicks off his entire villainous career in that particular movie. With that, I want to thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our unusually erudite panel. Chris Powell is going to be up next with his presentation on Pulp premium items. Then after that, we're going to go right into the auction. Thanks very much.